The morning was unusually still for late autumn in Ashford, Massachusetts. A pale fog clung to the dirt roads and withered fields, swallowing sound and shadow alike. The town's modest wooden homes, their roofs glazed with frost, stood silent, as though holding their breath. But near the edge of town, at the small farmhouse belonging to a widow named Martha Veylin, something was terribly wrong. It was just after dawn when Henry Lathrop, a farmer passing by on his way to milk his cows, noticed the door of Martha's home standing half open. That, in itself, might not have raised alarm, except for the trail of darkened footprints leading. Across the yard, their shapes muddied and stained, like a path of blood vanishing into the surrounding woods. Henry paused, unease prickling at his neck. The fog hung heavy, dampening every sound, yet he swore he could hear something faint, a slow, rhythmic creak, like the groan of old wood under strain. When he pushed the farmhouse door wider, the sight inside would linger in his memory for years. The air was thick with the sour smell of smoke and iron. A kerosene lamp had been knocked to the floor, its glass shattered, the last of its oil seeping into the dirt-streaked floorboards. One of the chairs lay overturned as though someone had risen in sudden alarm. And at the heart of the room, where the light of the hearth flickered weakly, was a pool of drying blood, dark and sticky, its edges already turning brown. Yet nobody lay upon the floor. No wounded victim crawled for help. There was only silence and an axe, its blade coated in a blackened sheen, propped casually against the brick of the hearth as if it had been left there in the middle of a task. Henry staggered back, heart pounding, and ran to gather neighbors. Within the hour, a small cluster of townsfolk stood at Martha's door, whispering and crossing themselves, their eyes darting from the stains on the floor to the gaping woods beyond. Whose blood was it? Had Martha been attacked, dragged into the forest? Or was she the one who had wielded the axe, now vanished into the fog like a phantom? The sheriff was summoned, though he too found no body, no clear explanation. Only that dreadful scene, and the lingering sense that violence had brushed through the house like a storm. Some pointed to the torn scraps of fabric caught on the doorframe, others to the boot prints muddled in blood near the hearth. Yet the most chilling detail was that axe. In towns like Ashford, tools were as common as breath, yet this one, with its thick wooden handle worn smooth from years of work, seemed to bear an unnatural weight. It was not simply a farmer's tool that morning. It was evidence. It was an accusation. By midday, rumors swirled like wildfire. Some swore Martha had fled, consumed by grief and madness, striking out at those around her before vanishing into the woods. Others whispered darker tales, that she had struck a bargain with forces unholy, that the axe was not hers to lay down. Women pulled their children inside. Men spoke in hushed voices outside the general store, careful not to say her name too loudly. For 2 days there was no sign of Martha. The farmhouse remained empty, the stains of blood still visible across the floor. Then, on the third evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and the church bell tolled vespers, a lone figure was spotted at the far edge of town. She moved slowly, her dark dress torn at the hem, her boots caked with mud. Her hands were raw, as though scraped and bloodied by rough labor. And her face, oh, her face was pale and expressionless, as if carved from stone. It was Martha Veylin. She said nothing as the townsfolk stared. She carried no bundle, no weapon, only the heavy silence of a woman who had been touched by something unspeakable. When asked where she had been, she gave no answer. When asked about the blood in her home, she only looked past them, her eyes unreadable, her lips pressed thin. The widow had returned. But whether she had come back as a victim or executioner, no one in Ashford yet knew. And soon they would discover that the truth was far darker than they ever imagined. To understand the mystery of Martha Veylin, one must first understand the world she belonged to. Ashford, Massachusetts, in the 1870s, was a town suspended between the past and the future. Its cobbled main street bore the steady clatter of horse, hooves, and wagon wheels, while gas lamps cast a pale, unsteady glow come evening. Yet just beyond the town square, farms stretched into the wooded countryside, their fields brown with the season's end, their barns creaking with the weight of centuries. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp leaves, and every Sunday, the townsfolk filled the clappered church at the center of town. In the sermons, they were reminded of sin, of virtue, and of the dangers of straying from God's light. Ashford was small, and its people closer still. News traveled faster than the trains that stopped once a week at the depot. A rumor whispered in the bakery at dawn could be gospel truth by dusk. It was into this world that Martha Veylin was born, some 32 years before the blood was first discovered on her floorboards. Her maiden name was Martha Collins, the second daughter of a cobbler and his weary wife. She grew up with calloused hands and a sharp mind, taught early that a woman's worth was measured in her obedience, her skill at keeping house, and her ability to endure. Ashford was not unkind, but it was unforgiving. Girls who laughed too loudly were called brazen, those who spoke their minds defiant. At 17, Martha married Samuel Veylin, a man 10 years her senior and a carpenter of good reputation. Samuel was no drunkard, nor was he violent, but he was stern. His words were measured, his expectations clear. Martha became mistress of a modest farmhouse on the edge of town, where smoke from the hearth was meant to rise straight and steady, a sign of domestic order. To the outside world, the marriage was ordinary, even enviable. But behind closed doors, the Veylin home was marked by shadows. 2 children were born to Martha in her first 5 years of marriage. Both fell ill before their second birthdays, fevers, that swept through the town and carried away the weakest. The graves in Ashford Cemetery filled that year with tiny headstones, and among them lay the Veylin infants. To lose one child was a sorrow. To lose 2 was a curse. The women of the church murmured prayers for Martha, though some whispered it was unnatural, the way she did not weep openly at the funerals. Samuel himself would not live much longer. In 1875, he was found beneath a collapsed beam in his workshop. His skull crushed, his tools scattered across the dirt floor. The death was ruled an accident, but a handful of men remembered hearing raised voices from the workshop that afternoon. Samuel's deep, commanding tones, and Martha's sharper retorts. For the first time, the widow's name passed from lips to lips, not in pity, but in suspicion. By 32, Martha Veylin was a widow with no children, no fortune, and little place in the rigid fabric of her community. She kept to herself, tending her small garden, trading herbs and remedies learned from her mother. Some neighbors claimed she could ease a cough with teas, cure burns with poultices, or calm nerves with tinctures, but others muttered that such knowledge was dangerous, that it smacked of witchcraft, of dealings best left unspoken. In New England, even 2 centuries after the Salem trials, those whispers still carried weight. The town's view of Martha was a paradox. To some she was pitiable, a woman marked by tragedy, moving silently through the streets with her head covered in a black shawl. To others, she was unsettling, her eyes too sharp, her silences too heavy. She had the air of someone apart, someone not bound by the same invisible rules that governed the rest of them. And so the stage was set. A town steeped in superstition, a woman hardened by grief, a life already marred by the deaths of those closest to her. When the first strange death, after Samuel's, began to ripple through Ashford, it did not come from nowhere. It rose from the soil of a community primed to fear, and from the heart of a widow who had already buried more than her share of the living. What began with whispered suspicion was about to bloom into terror, and at the center of it all would stand Martha Veylin, alone, inscrutable, and always within reach of an axe. Inscrutable and always within reach of an axe. Death had brushed Martha's life long before suspicion first fell upon her. But in Ashford, the line between misfortune and malice was thin, and soon the town would begin to see a pattern in the shadows that seemed to gather wherever the widow walked. The first of the deaths had already unsettled her reputation. Samuel Veylin, her husband, crushed beneath heavy timbers in his workshop. The coroner called it an accident, the collapse of a poorly braced beam. Yet a few neighbors recalled hearing a quarrel that day, Samuel's deep voice booming, Martha's sharper tones rising to meet it. What exactly passed between them was never known. But when the timbers fell, it was Martha who walked into the churchyard in her black shawl, her face unreadable as the coffin lowered into the ground. The town might have left it there an accident, a widow, an unfortunate fate had it not been for what followed. In the spring of 1877, a man named Joseph Halpern was found dead in a clearing not far from Martha's land. He was a farmhand, rough and broad-shouldered, with a taste for drink that often left him stumbling through Ashford's lanes. On that day, though, it was not liquor that felled him. His skull had been split cleanly by the blade of an axe, the wound sharp and deliberate. No tool was found nearby, and no one claimed to have seen the blow struck. But some said Joseph had been working odd jobs for Martha that season, chopping wood and mending fences. When questioned, Martha told the sheriff that Joseph had been drunk, that he had fallen or struck himself in a clumsy accident. But the wound told a different story. It was no jagged gash from a fall, no stumble into his own blade. It was a precise strike, the kind a steady hand might deliver. The sheriff, without witnesses or further proof, let the matter rest, though uneasily. Still, in the taverns and at the church steps, whispers grew louder. Wherever Martha went, death was sure to follow. It was the third death that turned whispers into shouts. Eleanor Briggs was a neighbor, and by some accounts one of Martha's few friends. She was a woman of middle years, known for her tidy home and her warm loaves of bread shared at Sunday gatherings. In September of 1878, Eleanor was found in her parlor, her body slumped against the hearth. Her skull bore the unmistakable marks of an axe. There were no signs of forced entry, no robbery, nothing taken. Only the silence of a life cut short, and, once again, the shadow of the widow next door. Several townsfolk swore they had seen Martha at Eleanor's door that afternoon, carrying a basket wrapped in cloth. What lay inside, no one could say, but they remembered her shawl, her lowered face, and the way she left with hurried steps as dusk fell. Hours later, Eleanor's daughter would discover her mother's body. By then, the community was gripped by fear. Doors were bolted before nightfall. Parents forbade their children from wandering near the Veylin property. In Sunday sermons, Reverend Clay spoke of judgment, of evil walking in familiar faces, of the dangers of sin festering unconfessed. Though he never spoke her name, all eyes turned toward Martha when his words echoed through the church rafters. Tordewine. Killings bore a terrible intimacy. These were not random murders committed in dark alleys or by faceless brigands. They happened in homes, in workshops, in places where trust lived. And always, an axe. A common tool, yes, but in Martha's hands, or near her presence, it seemed to transform from instrument of labor to instrument of execution. And what of Martha herself? Those who saw her in those years spoke of a woman more withdrawn than ever. She moved quietly, her shawl pulled low, her hands often raw from work. Some swore they saw her lips moving in muttered prayers as she walked the lanes at dusk. Others that she lingered at the graves of her children longer than grief alone might explain. Was she avenging wrongs real or imagined? Was she consumed by a madness born of sorrow? Or was she simply the scapegoat of a town eager to pour its fear into a single vessel? The answers were as murky as the autumn fog that clung to Ashford's streets. Yet one thing was certain. As the bodies mounted, suspicion hardened into certainty. To the people of Ashford, Martha Veylin was no longer merely the widow on the edge of town. She was the widow with an axe. And it was only a matter of time before the law came knocking at her door. And it was only a matter of time before the law came knocking at her door. By the autumn of 1878, fear had wrapped itself tightly around Ashford. Families who once left their doors unlatched now barred them with iron bolts. Neighbors no longer lingered on porches after supper. They hurried indoors as twilight deepened. At the heart of this unease stood one figure, Martha Veylin, the widow whose name now stirred dread in every conversation. The town could no longer turn its eyes away after Eleanor Briggs's death. To many it was the final proof that misfortune alone did not follow Martha. It was something far more deliberate. And so, Sheriff Elias Whitford stepped forward, determined to resolve what he saw as both a legal matter and a moral stain upon his town. Whitford was a man of stern bearing, broad-shouldered and silver-haired, though not yet old. He carried himself with the authority of one who believed in order, in scripture, and in the weight of justice. Yet, unlike the sheriffs of later years, he had little to aid him beyond his instincts and the testimonies of frightened townsfolk. Forensic science was a thing of the future. In 1878, guilt was measured in suspicion, in circumstance, and in what the community was willing to believe. The sheriff began by questioning those who had last seen Martha near Eleanor Briggs's home. Several swore she had been there that afternoon, her shawl pulled low, a basket in hand. Others recalled the strange way she hurried homeward, as though unwilling to be seen. One young boy, barely 12, insisted he had glimpsed something glinting beneath the cloth in her basket. Metal, he said, though he could not say more. Then came the matter of the axe. When Whitford and his deputies entered Martha's farmhouse, they found it resting once again near the hearth. Its blade bore faint, darkened stains, as though wiped clean but not entirely purged of its history. Martha explained it easily. It was her tool for chopping wood, nothing more. But the sheriff noted how often this same tool appeared in stories of blood and death. Whitford pressed further. He asked Martha where she had gone during those long hours when she vanished after the first bloody discovery in her home. She would not answer, only staring at him with a calm that unsettled him more than anger might have. He asked if she had quarreled with her husband the day he died, if she had struck him down. Martha's lips curled into the faintest smirk before she lowered her gaze. It was not confession, but it was not denial either. The town's patience frayed with each passing week. At the tavern, men muttered that the sheriff must act before more bodies fell. Mothers gathered in the churchyard and whispered that the widow was cursed, that she had brought death upon all who crossed her. And though Whitford wrestled with the lack of clear evidence, he could not deny that the weight of Ashford's fear now demanded action. The arrest came on a gray evening. The air was heavy with the smell of rain, the sky split with the low growl of thunder. Whitford and 2 deputies approached Martha's home. She was already on her porch, seated in her rocking chair, the axe propped beside her as though awaiting their arrival. Her dress was plain, her shawl drawn about her shoulders. When the sheriff stepped forward and declared his intent, she did not flee. She did not protest. She simply rose, placed her hands together, and looked him directly in the eye. Witnesses would later say that her expression was impossible to read, neither fear nor fury, but something closer to resignation, as though she had known this moment would come. At the jailhouse, Martha was questioned deep into the night. Whitford sought confession, but she gave him riddles. "The axe remembers," she said once, her voice steady. At another question, she fell into silence, her eyes fixed on the shadows of the lantern's flame against the wall. At times she seemed weary, at times almost amused. Never once did she plead her innocence. Meanwhile, the town was gripped by frenzy. Some declared her guilt absolute, convinced she was a cold-blooded murderer. Others whispered uneasily that she was being condemned not by proof, but by superstition and fear that perhaps Ashford, desperate for safety, had chosen a scapegoat. But the machinery of justice had already begun to turn. The widow was to stand trial, and in that courtroom the town of Ashford would seek not merely the truth but closure, however fragile. The gallows had not yet been built, but in many minds, the verdict was already The trial of Martha Veylin began in the spring of 1879, and in Ashford it was less a legal proceeding than a spectacle. The small courthouse, usually home to petty disputes over fences and debts, now overflowed with townsfolk eager to witness the fate of the widow with the axe. From the first morning, the wooden benches groaned under the weight of bodies, and those who could not squeeze inside lingered at the doors, straining to hear even a scrap of testimony. The prosecution painted Martha as a woman cloaked in grief, but driven by cold calculation. They recounted the quarrel before her husband's accident, the suspicious timing of Joseph Halpern's death, the undeniable brutality of Eleanor Briggs's murder. Each detail was tied again and again to the presence of Martha and her ever-present axe. They called it her instrument, her weapon, her signature. The defense, meanwhile, argued another picture, that of a lonely widow whose life had been marked by tragedy and cruel gossip. They reminded the jury that no one had seen her strike a blow, that no blood had been found on her person at the times in question, that in every case, the evidence was circumstantial. The axe, they said, was nothing more than a tool of survival, wielded by any farmer or widow who kept a home. If suspicion alone were enough to condemn, then no one in Ashford was safe. Yet as the days wore on, it was not hard evidence that swayed the courtroom, but Martha herself. When called to speak, she stood calm and unwavering, her shawl draped across her shoulders, her voice steady as she answered each question. Sometimes she denied, sometimes she evaded, but never once did she break into tears or plead for mercy. To the jury, this composure seemed unnatural. To the townsfolk who watched, it was confirmation of something dark within her. Then came her words, chilling in their simplicity. When asked at the trial's end if she wished to declare anything before the verdict was read, Martha spoke only 6 words. "The axe remembers more than you." A murmur swept the room, and even Sheriff Whitford, seated stiffly at the back, felt a shiver run down his spine. The verdict was delivered in hushed silence, guilty. The sentence, death by hanging. The execution was set for a gray morning in June. From the earliest hour, crowds gathered on the edge of town where the gallows had been hastily built. The air was damp with dew, the sky low and heavy, the sound of crows echoing across the fields. Martha was led forward in a plain dress, her hands bound, her face serene. Some said she looked almost peaceful, as though walking not to her death but to a certainty she had long prepared for. The noose was placed around her neck. The sheriff asked if she had any final words. She lifted her chin slightly, her eyes scanning the crowd. Then she spoke softly, so quietly that only those nearest could hear. "The axe remembers." The trap was pulled. The crowd gasped. And with that, Martha Veylin's life ended. But her legend was only beginning. In the years that followed, the people of Ashford struggled to carry on. Some felt relief, believing justice had been served. Others carried unease, whispering that an innocent woman had been condemned by fear and superstition. The farmhouse where Martha had lived was abandoned, its shutters banging in the wind, its hearth cold and silent. Children dared one another to run to its porch, claiming they could still see the axe leaning against the hearth, though no one ever touched it. Folklore grew quickly, as it always does. Some said the widow's spirit lingered in the woods, axe in hand, watching those who dared to wander too near. Others swore her calm smile on the gallows was proof she knew secrets the town could never uncover, that perhaps she had killed or perhaps she had not, but either way she had left behind a shadow that would never fade. Even now, in scraps of New England folklore, her name still surfaces, Martha Veylin, the widow with an axe. To some, she remains a monster, a murderess who brought terror to a quiet town. To others, she is a victim of grief, of whispers, of a society quick to condemn a woman who lived outside its fragile expectations. And so her story ends not with certainty, but with a question. Was Martha truly guilty of the crimes laid upon her? Or had Ashford buried its fear in her grave along with her body? The records will never tell us, but the legend remains whispered in dark corners, carried on the wind through the abandoned fields of Ashford. The widow with the axe, whose memory is as sharp and as unyielding as the blade itself.